Sandwich Generation Survival Guide, caring for your children, your parents, and yourself with your hosts, Candace Dellacona and Jodi.argentino. Welcome.
Great to see you this afternoon, Candace.
Happy Independence Month, Jodi. We're celebrating all things independent for the month of July here at the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide.
I'm so excited for that because, at 47, I'm still learning it.
I mean, aren't we all? It's our life's journey towards independence. And on that note, and with that theme in mind, we decided to talk this episode about prenups and postnups and everything in between.
Right. So welcome to episode 5.
Miss Independent, I think we're going to call it.
Miss Independent. And even with that, I will say this is also Mix Independent or Mr. Independent. But for sure, we of course, given who we are going to focus a little bit more on the independence of the misses.
Yeah, it sounds great. And, for our guests, we're so lucky, Jodi, that we have you as someone that I will call an expert in the field of agreements like this. As many of our listeners know, you are a family law matrimonial attorney. So this is squarely in your wheelhouse, and it's going to be more of the Jodi show where you're going to educate me and our listeners on all things related to these types of agreements. So are you ready to be peppered with questions so that you can give us a good indication of what you've been doing as your life's work for the past 20 years?
Well, I'm going to try. I'm not sure we can fit that into 30 minutes, but I'm going to give that a shot.
I think you can do it.
Right. So when we talk about prenups, it's not just prenups, right? We're talking about any sort of agreement that is reflective of a relationship that you're entering into. So
Okay.
For parents, you have co-parenting agreements. If you're roommates, you can have a roommate agreement or a cohabitation agreement. Because I don't want to just get stuck on prenups with that concept. And you know me, I'm always like to think inclusive and make it make something a project rather than simple. But we're talking about not just relationships that look at the hierarchical chain of command such that marriage is the pinnacle, right? We want to look at all types of relationships to protect ourselves, regardless of whether we choose to have a marriage license or whether we choose to have a cohabitation with individual or individuals, that we care about.
Right.
So, but, for the thing that strikes me the most is often prenups because it goes along with something that in general so much focus is made on planning for, i.e. a wedding.
Sure.
Right. But prenups sort of get the short end of the stick, like it gets tossed to the side.
Lost in the shuffle after the flower arrangements.
Right. And you're like, okay, but why am I spending, XYZ $1,000 on flowers? But I don't want to spend $2,500 on a prenup that is going to protect me indefinitely. This concept to me came about when I was sitting in Panera Bread, working on someone's prenup. Yes, this is what I do on my Saturdays. Whoopty. But I had a house full of people and I was like, I cannot do this. And someone called me and they were getting married in 2 weeks and wanted a prenup. And I was like, oh, it's awesome. It's 2 weeks out. That is not appropriate. But c'est la vie, trying to get this done for this family. So I lock myself in Panera Bread and a gaggle of women come in and they are sitting at the table next to me, multi-generation. And they're talking about the dress and the flowers and the date of the wedding. And the wedding's a year and a half away. And so I'm like, well, clearly they have just come from one bridal shop and are going to another bridal shop. And I found it ironic that I was sitting there drafting a prenup for someone that was getting married in 2 weeks, who had assumedly done all of those other things well in advance.
Right.
So I'm sitting there and I'm chit-chatting with one of the I think aunts while everyone else is getting their bagels. And I said, what's funny? I'm sitting here doing a prenup and everybody spends all this time on a dress a year and a half in advance, but I'm doing this prenup 2 weeks in advance, and it's just sort of funny to me that investment is sort of off balance there.
Yeah.
And she said to me, well, we're lucky. No one in our family has ever needed or ever been with someone who required a prenup. I tried to just, be diplomatic and yes her. But I'm thinking in my head, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. First of all, it's not up to the other person to require something of you, right? You want to talk about misindependence. You want to take responsibility for yourself, right? And you're the one that needs the prenup. If someone else asks you for it, great, they've initiated the process. But, and the other part of that made no sense to me was the we don't need it concept.
Yeah.
And I think there's a huge misconception with regard to prenups, cohab agreements, even like custody or parenting time agreements.
Sure.
Because people are like, well, we get along, it's just fine. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's fine until it's not.
Yeah.
Right?
So
Like,
let's talk about that though, right? So, many of our listeners are parents to marriage age children, maybe, or we as parents ourselves, perhaps are, into or over our first marriage, and we're considering a second marriage or a cohabitation with a partner. And obviously, you point out so succinctly the fact that there are these major misconceptions around the topic. And I think maybe what would be helpful to our audience is, why don't we talk about the purpose of the prenup in more maybe constructible terms, right? It's, first of all, protecting what you have or the other person, but specifically you. We're talking about you protecting what you have that you're going into this relationship with, right?
Right. But that's where people stop. Like, people think, well, if I don't have anything coming into this relationship, I
Right.
don't have anything to protect. First of all, there's no one that goes into a relationship with nothing, right? You may not have a 401k or own a house, right? But you assumedly have an income, or if you don't have an income, right, you are relying on the other person. So you're coming in with something that is your person to protect.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that people miss is you are protecting the life you're creating
With the person.
with the person. So
Yeah.
it is not just all like doom and gloom, right?
Right.
It is. And so I try to tell people, take this opportunity to talk about what you want your life to look like.
Like a life plan.
It's a life plan. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. It's like we sit there and we do that for estate planning, right, Candace? Like, okay,
Well, we
what do you
hope
want
we
it to look
do.
like when you
Yeah.
die?
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
what do you want it to look like when you live?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And why that gets shoved aside when people are so focused on one day of planning rather than like the lifetime of planning
Sure.
is it really strikes me as misplaced.
Yeah.
Right. So, and sometimes people are like, I don't understand. What do you mean? The life you're planning. Okay, well, you got to talk about your home, what you plan to do for savings, even what you plan to do with children. Now, you can't put children into a prenup, like specifically if you don't have them, but you can consider any like financial obligations to prior children, or like children from a prior marriage, or a general concept of what you think that both of you are going to do with regard to children's caregiving, because it affects your finances, right? So, I recently did a prenup for someone where each party made about $300,000 a year. Wonderful. And so they're just thinking, okay, we're going to keep our own stuff. Like, if we get divorced, we'll keep our own stuff. They both had assets. And I'm like, that's great. Okay, so what happens if you have a kid and one of you stays home from work and the other one decides you're getting divorced during that, initial year of your child's life where you are not working at that time? They're like, well, wait, what? Right?
Right. So a prenup or an agreement like that, Jodi, can cover the unknowns and force the conversation about what would
Right.
actually happen. So similar to like when I'm drafting a will for people, people think they're going to live forever. They don't. P.S. But you and I are drafting similarly for the parade of horribles, the what ifs.
Right. But also not just the horribles, Candace. Like, it is the amount of, well, this is going to be horrible what I say, but so I guess it is a parade of horribles. But the biggest question I get is, or the biggest question I give, I suppose, that people are like, oh, wow, hadn't thought about that, is what happens if someone becomes disabled?
Yeah.
Right? Because, people say, okay, we'll take our own, we'll go away. Okay, great. But what if someone has a traumatic incident and which we can't plan for, right? And then they no longer could survive on their own. They could not financially survive if they were divorced from the other person and not provided for financially in some way. And that has made, I will tell you, probably 90% of the prenups that I do, the people have never talked about it and are completely stumped
Yeah.
as to what they should do about that situation.
Yeah. So do you find that when you meet with clients and you go over things like, okay, what happens in terms of the home or the apartment you're living in? What happens in terms of savings that you walked in with versus what you've accumulated? What happens with the kids? When it comes to disability, what I'm hearing from you is that perhaps these conversations are happening or actually coming about because it's brought up by someone like you to say, let's talk about what we envision happening if the worst would occur.
Right.
Which, can be really hard, but certainly I think, look, if you're entering into a marriage or a cohabitation with someone, you have to have these difficult conversations, right?
Right. And truth be told, the prenup is more about transparency than anything else, right? We're talking about what you're coming in with, but also, and what your
Well,
history
let's
is.
talk
But
about that. What do
okay,
you come in with? You sit down with an attorney, and do you think a good starting off point is to come up with the assets that you own and maybe the value of those assets? Is that what's expected in terms of the exercise and getting started?
sure. The first thing that I ask people for is a list of their assets and debts,
Okay. And
and a
what'd you say?
recording
And
of their
debts.
income.
Okay.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
so
because
that's
your
important
assets,
too, like
you know,
student loans, right?
right. Student loans, but
Mortgage,
like you have a house, it's not just an asset. There's a debt associated with that.
most
Right. So your
times.
net value is, if you have a $600,000 house and a $400,000 mortgage, it's not a $600,000 asset. It's $200,000 asset, right? Where
Sure.
you're talking about net worth.
Right.
So it's important for people to be. It's amazing how many people do not go into a relationship or into a marriage, um, knowing that information about the other individual.
Well,
Um,
let's talk about that why though, right? Culturally, a lot of times we see it as impolite, bringing up
right.
net worth, assets that you own, debts that you have. We've talked about this in another podcast in terms of, you know, money and shame and all the things that could be tied
Absolutely.
to it, right? And then you're putting your best foot forward because you're getting married to this dream person or cohabitating with this dream person. And then you're like, well, actually, I've defaulted on all my student loans and my credit rating is a 600. Um,
Right. And it's
it's,
shame. Nobody wants to talk
yeah,
about it, right?
yeah,
You want to present your best self to the person that you want to spend your life with, but the issue is that you're going to be intertwined with that person. No matter how much you put in a prenup, we're going to keep all our finances separate. It's impossible
yeah,
to keep things completely separately
for
and live
sure.
together or raise a family together.
So starting with, we're coming to see Jodi, and you know, you say, well, you have to come up with a list of assets that you own and the debts that are associated with you or those assets. And I assume what sort of income you're earning at the current time, right? So it's like a snapshot. Does that sound right?
That's exactly right. It's a
Yeah,
snapshot. And it's because if you don't, it's the same thing at the time of divorce, right? If you don't know what's there, you don't know what you're protecting.
right,
If you
right.
and like certain states have statutes that require a full disclosure. And if that full disclosure does not exist, that prenup's being thrown out
So
like a sack
is
of
that the
water.
case in New York? Is there a disclosure
Uh,
requirement?
in New York and New Jersey, we always do disclosure
Sure.
requirements. They're sometimes more detailed than others. I know some attorneys that will just have a general recitation of things. I am very, very particular in having things detailed because I have done litigation on the back end of this, right? Like
Right.
I've
So were
done
you things where
litigation,
things have gone wrong?
right? Where I look
Yeah.
at an agreement, I'm like, how the heck is that a prenup?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if I can poke holes in it, I'm not going to put that out under my name as a prenup
Right.
if
You're
I
not
think
going to
I could
draft
litigate
something.
against it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that makes sense. I mean, so then once you come up with the list, right, you're also coming with, along with the list comes the person.
Right.
And like we said, your attitude towards money and debt, and, whether or not your career is a new one or you have been making money for a while. And perhaps what the net worth is of your family and what maybe you'll be inheriting one day. So it's not just a snapshot of you. There is a big picture here lurking in the background, right?
For sure. And while you don't have to list your family's assets and debts, having something like anticipated inheritance is really important to address,
Yeah.
because it's going to, sometimes it will actually defeat the concept of unconscionability. Now, that was a lot of big words, right? But like, one of the things that can get a prenup thrown out is if it is unconscionable, right?
Meaning,
Which is meaning that it is like it is unfair, inherently unfair
okay.
in a particular circumstance. So, and that's my definition, not like Webster's or Black's Law Dictionary, right? But basically, that is one of the reasons I press so heavily on the disability, making sure disability is accounted for. Because if you had someone making $500,000 a year and someone making nothing, and you put in a prenup that they're going to walk away with their own and there's no alimony, that could very well be considered unconscionable. However,
Got
if
it.
you have that same situation, but both people are making $500,000 a year, but one then becomes disabled, that agreement could be seen as unconscionable because there was no provision for that,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So,
So transparency and forecasting for the future can really determine the viability of the document you're entering into. So you
right,
got to tell your lawyer everything. That is,
right. And so,
as with most things, you should tell your lawyer everything.
right. And some people will say, oh, well, it's, I don't care about that. Or like, well, can't we I'll just give in on that part. And I'm like, okay, but that doesn't, if you're bothering to do this, why aren't you going to do it right?
Yeah.
Right.
No, that right,
Again,
exactly.
and which is the whole reason why we try not to do these agreements a couple of weeks in advance,
Sure.
because conversations need to be had. So
Yeah.
a lot of people have a complete misunderstanding of marital property,
Yeah, let's talk
right?
about that. So let's talk about, what's yours versus what's
What's mine?
theirs
Yep.
and what's mine and what's ours. Like, how do you determine all of that? Fill us in figuring that out.
So different states have different laws with what qualifies as marital property or community property versus individual property.
Okay.
So first of all, you have to know what you're talking about. But uh, oftentimes things like gifts or inheritance, or premarital things would automatically be excluded from we'll call it the marital pot, right?
Okay.
But what people don't understand a lot of the times, and I often see this as a divorce attorney, not as a prenup attorney, right, is people will say, well, yes, that's my retirement, but it's been entirely in my name. And I'm like, that's lovely. But every penny you earned during the marriage is marital money, right? So that retirement is marital money. Or
So is
someone
the
will have,
whole pot of marital, pardon me, is the whole pot of retirement assets, if I walk into a relationship with $1 million and then during the course of the relationship, marriage or otherwise, I earn an additional 500,000, so it's a total of 1.5 million. Is the 1.5 million marital or joint, or not joint, obviously, but
right.
or is it just the 500,000 that I earned during the relationship?
It is the portion from the relationship during what we call the coverture, of the marriage, from the beginning of the marriage till whatever end date is pursuant to statute in that particular state or case law. But it's also the growth and loss on that amount,
Ah,
right?
okay,
So it's not like a yes or no question. Of course, I'm going
got
to
it.
give you the lawyer answer. That's like, oh, it depends. But so many people are like, well, just put like, if it's, if it's in my name, it's mine. And I'm like, great, but like, let's talk about that, because what if it's a house? What if you're using money from an individual account to pay for part of a mortgage? What if you buy a couch together? What if you like, and so I get a lot of people are like, stop, like, I don't want to think about all of that. I'm like, that's wonderful, but you
We
actually
have
have to
to.
think about it either way, whether you're going to deal with it or not. At some point, you're going to deal with it.
Well, let's talk about
So,
that. So,
yeah.
like, what if it's an inheritance, which is clearly separate, right? Except
Mhm.
if I inherit $250,000 and I take that $250,000 and I purchase a house with my new spouse and we're jointly on title. Is my inheritance still separate? Can I carve that out from the value if the marriage ends and it's not really addressed well in the prenup.
Well, I mean, my first piece of advice is to address it well in a prenup, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm always trying to do is anything that's already owned or anything that's anticipated, or even if it's not, we just put it in there anyway and say, if this is the case and I contribute this, then I'm going to get that back out. But we also
Got
have
it.
to make contingencies for if the property value is less than the money's put in, right? So we have to make sure that we're doing it by percentage or some other creative formula so that it doesn't become unconscionable, or it doesn't become inequitable or impractical, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And then other things that we talk about is, all right, are there going to be career breaks for child rearing, and how does that affect any alimony obligation or
So
any
that's an
support?
income, right? That's like an income. So in a prenup or a cohabitation agreement or an agreement in general, you have an asset section and then you have an income / support section.
So yes, we have different sections that deal with different things, but it's a little more overlapping in a prenup than probably in a divorce context, because part of the issue is talking about career building, right? And whether you're going to take a career break. And so that then affects your assets. And that also affects whether you're going to have a disability policy and whether that's going to be part of your plan. So it's really about this planning and contribution to retirement and what your expectations for spending are.
Yeah.
Are you going to spend on a joint credit card? Are you going to jointly pay that credit card? So there's a lot of this that, yes, you can get into a lot of details, and some people want a lot of details.
Right.
And some people want general concepts.
Right.
Either is okay, so long as the bottom line has some sort of formula to be able to figure out what should have been done, right?
Yeah.
Or like what should be considered.
Right. I mean, so, you brought up in the beginning talking about overhearing these women a year out talking about a dress, and you're drafting an agreement 2 weeks in advance. I mean, just by virtue of this conversation and how many little nuances and nooks and crannies and maybe spin-off discussions that relate to all the issues that you have to cover in a prenup, it's never good to do it last minute. But my question for you is, what if you are the person at 2 weeks out, like, oh gosh, it isn't something that I've considered. Are they enforceable if they're drafted so close to a wedding?
It is not just one factor.
Okay.
Right? So it wouldn't be like, oh, this is signed a week before the wedding or the morning of the wedding. That is not enforceable, but it's really a totality of the circumstances.
So
if you've been working on it
specific.
for a year, right, but you just don't sign it until that day, it's very different than if somebody pops up the morning of your wedding and before you sign a ketubah makes you sign like a Jewish marriage license.
Yeah.
Before you sign that, you're signing a prenup because they shoved it in your face.
Sure.
Right? It makes a difference.
Yeah.
I have less of an issue doing a prenup for people sooner if there wasn't a significant amount of wedding planning.
Got it.
Right?
And
so if people are like eloping or like, just not having a big deal of a ordeal of a wedding. But once you start putting deposits down and this and that, right? Like I had a case once where they were 3 weeks before the wedding and he did not want to put in the woman, it was a heterosexual marriage. And so the guy didn't want to put anything in there with regard to alimony, but expected the school teacher party that I represented to waive alimony, but also expected her to stay home with the kids. And I was like, this is a ridiculous, like, this is, it shouldn't be thrown out.
It's incongruent because how could you do both? Right. So, well, so to that, to that
but
point,
it's 2 weeks before the wedding. Hold on. That's the important part, right?
Yeah.
2 weeks before the wedding, she's got her dress. The invitations are out. Everyone's RSVP'd. And now she's at a position where she has to say, I don't want to marry you in 2 weeks. Someone has to stand up for that. Right. And say, but you've got family pressure, you've got societal pressure, you've got all of that stuff, and then combine it with the shame. There's a lot of pressure. And if you're, she's like, well, just take it out. I'm like, I'm not going to just take it out. You can go hire a different attorney. Right. But I'm not just going to take that out. That's not
Because
can't
you
do
see
that.
that as an integral part of the agreement itself and for your client's protection.
Like,
So
we can reword it, we can figure it out, we can come up with different solutions, we can put a cap on it or a baseline on it or something, right? There has to be a solution to it. I'm a problem solver.
but let's say that, they're at an impasse, right? They missed the boat. She stops returning your phone call. It never gets signed. I hear people talk about, well, you can just do a postnup. I mean, is that really a thing? I hear conflicting sort of bits of information about what a postnup is and how enforceable it is at all, and whether or not you should bother.
And the thing is, it for good cause you hear conflicting information, because there's not really a perfect answer for that. And I know some people are like, oh, well, we drafted it all, but then we signed it after the wedding. And I'm like, like
Yikes.
palm to face.
Yeah.
So what happens is that when you have the wedding, in basic contract law, there has to be consideration, right? What we call consideration. So it has to be like, you get something to give something.
Right.
And if the marriage already happened, the contingency is gone.
Sure.
Like the consideration is gone.
Right.
So like there's no, you're not bargaining for something.
There's no quid pro quo anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it dilutes the effectiveness of it. And so sometimes a postnup I see more often when people are haven't done it at all, and like later something is spurring it, someone's getting inheritance, or someone is
hitting it big with finances or something. Yeah.
Or having a discrepancy or a potential issue in their marriage.
Yeah.
But postnups are often not enforceable because of that consideration piece.
Yeah.
And there's been, like in New Jersey, there's been some case law that indicates that, okay, if you can maybe have that consideration. If someone files for divorce and then you do a reconciliation agreement, the consideration, right, is the withdrawing of the divorce complaint.
Got it. So, and you're saying I'm withdrawing my divorce complaint because we're agreeing to this if something ever comes to fruition.
Right.
Got it.
So it's more of a reconciliation agreement that falls into the postnup category.
Sure.
But the major point, it's the same with a cohabitation agreement, right? There has to be consideration. What happens if you don't sign the agreement? Well, you don't move in, you don't buy the house together, whatever that is. So
but you need to have that. You need to have that piece to make it really a viable instrument that's enforceable later on. So don't bother unless you have that. And then so, for our listeners out there who are, like we said, parents of marriageable age for their children, and you don't want to be the annoying mother-in-law or the father-in-law saying, hey, what about a prenup? I mean, I think that, maybe the best way to approach it with your child is, and maybe tell me if I'm wrong, is to say, hey, it's not just about your protection, it's about their protection too.
Right. Yeah. And I always say that to people. I'm like, it's protecting both of you. It's not a one-sided thing. So back to that lady in Panera Bread where it was like, oh, no one's ever required one. And I'm like, no, but it doesn't matter. It's for both of you to make sure that you are covered, but also that you've discussed all of these things and have this concept, and you're not after your marriage fighting about how much someone's going to put away for retirement or what the expectation for that is. Right. It's rather have the argument before. Yeah.
I mean, it's so funny, depending on your religious affiliation, Catholic people go through something called pre-Cana.
Right.
Others may meet with their rabbi to talk about, certain issues as it relates to expectations in family and family rearing and that kind of thing. And, maybe if this issue was able to be reframed in a way that didn't feel so uncomfortable. And back to, our American roots, we're talking about Miss Independent and 4th of July and all these things, and the shame associated with talking about things like money, where we just kind of rip the Band-Aid off of whatever preconceived notions we have and really, own that and maybe in some ways, I'm going to go a step further and say, perhaps you can have an even stronger foundation when you talk about these difficult issues.
Right. And I've actually had people thank me for that and said, wow, we weren't talking about this, but this really brought up a serious conversation for us, and, brought a lot of clarity to like how we want to live our lives.
And so were there ever any clients that said, after you brought up these difficult conversations where they said, you know what, we're actually completely at a place where, our thoughts are not at all cohesive and we're not going to get married? Has that ever happened that you know of?
Not in that way. I
Okay.
definitely have had people take a break
Okay.
from the discussions.
Sure.
Like be like, we need to not focus on this for a couple of weeks and we need to each think about it and we need to come back to it. But that said, I am also very much like the master of the workaround. So like, I usually don't present a problem to someone without presenting a potential solution to them.
Well,
So
which, yeah, I mean, that's important for our listeners too, right? Where, in the same way when I'm drafting a will and you're trying to think of guardians for your kids, and there is no perfect person, our jobs, as your lawyers, as your consiglieres, your counselors, is to help you come up with solutions. So maybe, in that spirit, it's not to be intimidated by these really heavy topics, but to like figure out a way to work through them, right, Jodi?
right. And it's like, if you have enough time to do that, right, then you're not talking about, you know, death and taxes all in one week,
Yeah, I
right?
love that. Yeah.
You're spreading it out and you're talking about your kids, and then your plans for life, you're talking about your career, you're talking about, how you want to spend your money or save your money, and it's an organic discussion.
Yeah.
Maybe I've spurred it, but it's an
Yeah.
organic discussion, not one
Yeah.
that's like under pressure, under duress.
And I
It's like,
love what you say, Jodi, if any of our listeners have been lucky enough to attend one of Jodi's many, many opportunities for public speaking and seminars that she teaches. And I love the way that you kind of present to our audience, kind of like the key takeaways, right? Like, don't lose sight of the big picture. You
right,
love this person. You should have these challenging conversations. It will hopefully bring you closer and remind you why this is your person, why you want to live together or get married.
right. Or if
Yeah,
not, if you have a core issue, it gives you the opportunity to work through it
yeah,
before you're, in hot water about it.
yeah.
Right?
And
Like,
resolve conflict, maybe.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the bottom line is talk to an expert. It's important that the state in which you reside, you reach out to an expert. Obviously, feel free to email us. Jodi can connect you with our network of attorneys. You need your own attorney. Prenups should
Yes,
not be
absolutely.
drafted by one lawyer. Every party needs their own lawyer. So no joint prenups, right, Jodi?
No, most states do not allow joint prenups.
With good
Some
reason.
countries do, but certainly anyone that says, "Oh no, I'll do it for both of you," and then it's either going to be rubber stamped by another attorney. All of these things are things that are like, no, like don't do those, because it's just going to come back and bite you in the ass. It's one of
No
those things
legal
that,
Zoom, none of those
right?
online shticks. Nothing is
No,
one size
ugh,
fits all.
no, I can't even
Right.
discuss the online
Right. Well, we
services.
won't. We won't. But, thank you so much, Jodi, for enlightening me and enlightening our audience. This really important topic, maintaining your independence. Happy 4th of July and all that good stuff. So thank you to everyone for listening. And we cannot wait to be back to you in the next 2 weeks with another very interesting topic. We're going to be talking about long-term care and home care and all the things that go along with it. So stay
Which I'm
tuned, everyone.
excited about, Candace, because you get to talk the whole time on that one.
Can't wait. Thanks again,
Awesome.
everyone.